Good evening. I'm David Axelrod. I'm the founder of the Institute of Politics. I'm now the chairman of the IOP's Board of Advisors, which means that Heidi Heitkamp tells me what to do. And we're pleased to welcome you to today's latest speaker series event, Crime and Punishment, two recent governors' views. And Governor Hutchinson, Governor Brown, we're so happy to have you. And Governor Hutchinson, I want you to know that shortly before he announced for president, Barack Obama appeared at an event here, so the karma's good. The karma's good. Yes. Before one of our students introduces our guest formally, I'd like to mention that today's event is the debut of a new speaker series program called Counterpoint. This ongoing series will host two experts who will engage in civil discourse on opposing policy views on a variety of subjects. We will be hosting more Counterpoint events in the next academic year. So we promise civil discourse, so don't mess us up on the first. Finally, I want to take a moment to reflect on the recent loss of a member of our student community, second-year student Niv Sparks. It is painful whenever we lose a member of our community. It's particularly painful when we lose someone whose whole life is in front of them. And there is a memorial service going on, I understand, right now on another part of campus. There are people who wanted to be here, who had to be there for reasons that we all understand. But our thoughts and our prayers are with his family and his friends. And now, please let me welcome Laura Junio, a third-year student in the college and the current IOP intern, to the stage for formal introductions.
Hello, and welcome to Counterpoint Crime and Punishment. My name is Laura Junio, and I'm a third year at the college studying political science, philosophy, and law letters and society. I am one of the fellows interns at the IOP, and I was the president of the Chicago Debate Society this past year. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, former Governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, and former Governor of Oregon, Kate Brown. Governor Hutchinson served as a district attorney prior to his time in public office. He is a proponent of the death penalty and is a tough-on-crime Republican who recently announced his bid to become the Republican nominee for president in 2024. During his governorship, he responded to rising crime in Arkansas by promising to increase the number of prisons as a way to deal with overcrowding, providing more funding for DAs and public defenders, and increasing the supervision of parolees. Governor Brown was one of the leading governors on progressive clemency policies. She commuted the sentences of 17 individuals awaiting execution on death row, as well as the sentences of 45,000 individuals serving for marijuana possession. During her governorship, she signed into law a bill that decriminalized personal use of drugs such as meth, cocaine, and heroin, and put money into funding treatment programs. Both governors left office earlier this year. This debate will be moderated by Jane Coaston of the New York Times. Jane hosted The Argument, a weekly debate-style show for the Times. She previously served as an IOP Pritzker Fellow. Please silence your cell phones. We will have a stationary microphone in the audience for the Q&A portion, and the first 3 questions will go to students. Please also check out our upcoming speaker series events. On April 25th, we have an event on journalists under fire, which will explore threats facing reporters around the world. That event will be at the Quad Club at 5:30. Then on May 1st, we have an event called China's Challenges, a nation's problems viewed from the inside out. That event will be at the Quad Club at 5:30. Please join me in welcoming former Governors Hutchinson and Brown and Ms. Coaston.
Well, thank you so much for welcoming me back to the University of Chicago, except I did not like that it was 30 degrees yesterday. That was not cool. So I want to start out, and I want to, again, I told this to both governors, but I want them to talk to one another. we have a rare opportunity today, which is to see the governor of a blue state and the governor of a red state have a conversation together with their mouths. I'm excited to see what you two have to say to one another, and I'm excited to see what you have to say to our audience. So, Governor Brown, you granted more commutations or pardons than all Oregon governors for the past 50 years combined. In December of 2022, as was mentioned, you commuted the sentences of all 17 people on death row, but death row in 2020 had largely been eliminated as a physical existence in the state of Oregon. There had been a moratorium on the death penalty that began in 2011, and so you were essentially continuing those policies. What do you think has influenced how Oregon sees the issue of the death penalty, and why was that important for you to continue?
Thank you, and really appreciate the honor of being here, and want to say a thank you to Senator Heitkamp for inviting me. It's good to be back in the Midwest. I'm going to start out a bit more broadly. I absolutely believe that we are a nation of second chances, and that it's time that our values match our actions. I also absolutely believe, in terms of criminal justice, our criminal justice system, is that it is a system built on the backs of Black and brown people, that its underlying structure is racist. And from my perspective, it's so incredibly important for governors to use their clemency tools. It is the most important, most powerful tool that a governor has to embed fairness and justice in our criminal justice system. I believe it will take years for us to eradicate racism in our criminal justice system. So this is an incredibly important tool that a governor can take action with immediately in line with his or their values. In terms of the death penalty, as you said, from a legal standpoint, the circumstances were being narrowed. I had issued a moratorium when I came in following Governor Kitzhaber's moratorium. And the legislature had substantially narrowed the crimes to which the death penalty would apply. The other thing that my administration did was direct the Department of Corrections to take down death row, to essentially eliminate it at our Department of Corrections. From my perspective, it is absolutely immoral for the state to put someone to death. It is, the death penalty in this country has been applied unfairly and inequitably across the United States. I do not believe that the death penalty serves a legitimate purpose, and frankly, it costs taxpayers a lot of money. So I was very clear when I ran for election and then re-election that I would issue the moratorium, and the voters of Oregon overwhelmingly elected me on that platform. And I was the second governor, now the third governor, Governor Kotek, ran on basically the same platform. So we had solid support from our voters to take the action that we took.
Governor Hutchinson, you represented a different constituency, and Arkansas voters have largely been supportive of the use of the death penalty. In April of 2017, you scheduled 8 executions in 10 days. 4 were blocked by a court order, but 4 people were executed. Why was it important to you? I mean, there was the conversation that one of the drugs that is to be used in the process of the death penalty was about to expire, but why was that an important decision for you to make? And I know it's come up again and again for you, but I just want you to tell our audience, why was that important for you to do?
Well, thank you, and it is great to be at the University of Chicago. It's good to be with Governor Brown. We're on opposite views, but we like each other. But we're going to go after each other
You
tonight.
shouldn't say that out loud, though.
And I'll start as Governor Brown did in a little bit broader perspective. To me, one of the great things about America's democracy is the rule of law that undergirds it. And that's what separates us from Mexico, that does not have a rule of law that works for them. The criminal justice system doesn't work in that country. You look at China, an economic threat to us, but I feel comfortable that we'll always be able to prevail against China because they do not have a good rule of law system in that country. And we do, and it sets the United States apart. But then I look at the rise in violent crime. I look at the fact that we have smash and grab in our stores, and businesses are saying, I don't want to be located here because of the uncontrolled violence. That's an embarrassment to me as an American, that we don't have respect for one another in our community, and that we don't have a orderly society. And I think that is very, very important to the functioning of democracy. Now, we come back, I think we have a good balance, but we'll talk specifically about the death penalty. The legislature in Arkansas, as elected representatives, followed the Supreme Court mandate and redid the death penalty, where you have to have specific aggravating circumstances, where mitigating circumstances are impacted. You have to have competent counsel. They have numerous appeals from that and reviews of that. And so our death penalty statute has been affirmed by the United States Supreme Court as meeting the requirements of due process. As governor, I took an oath to uphold the laws of Arkansas and the Constitution and to faithfully execute the laws. And so when the Attorney General sends me the fact that we have inmates that have exhausted their appeals, that they're ready for the carrying out the jury verdict of execution, it's my duty to do that. We did that. And I knew whenever we had 8 that the courts are going to review and probably put a clog in a few of them. I commuted one of them as well. And then we faithfully executed the laws on the rest. These are specifically heinous crimes that the jury found warranted the death penalty. And, if you look at the broad scope of America, whenever you look at Timothy McVeigh, that blew up the Murrah Federal Building, and killed innocent children and people in mass quantity. The death penalty, in my judgment, was appropriate in that circumstances, with those aggravated circumstances, and that's appropriate under federal law. And the state law can, in the same vein, provide that. I can talk about that a little bit more. I'd like to engage you just a second, Kate.
Okay.
So Arkansas sits here and looks at Oregon, and I mentioned smash and grab, and I look at the riots after the George Floyd, the protest in the summer of 2020, and I'm sitting there in amazement as what I see as an American tragedy in Portland, Oregon. So explain to me why the law wasn't enforced and why the violence was allowed to continue in such a dramatic fashion on the national stage.
Well, I think there are a number of challenges, and I think our cities across America are facing them post-pandemic. Obviously, post-murder of George Floyd, empty storefronts, you have housing and drug issues facing folks on the streets. All of these issues are there. For me, what I felt and saw was former President Trump sending in troops from the Department of Homeland Security that weren't trained in crowd control. And during the time they were in the city of Portland, seriously injured a young man. And it was my call to the White House to say, please get your people out of our streets because the next person that dies will be on your hands. And the fact that the president felt he could send federal troops in to address the issue there when that exacerbated the issue was absolutely unacceptable. And following my conversations with the White House, the troops pulled back 48 hours later. So has there been unrest in cities across the country? Absolutely. I think law enforcement is working closely with community organizations to make sure that people on both sides, all sides of these issues, are safe. But here's what we know in this country. The get tough on crime rhetoric that is happening now, that happened in the 80s, there is a disproportionate impact from that work on communities of color, on Black and brown communities. What happened in the 80s and 90s in states like Oregon, we have some of the toughest get tough on crime measures in the entire country. In terms of disproportionality, 2% of our population is Black, 9% of our folks behind bars are Black. In terms of the Latino population, about 14% Latino population in Oregon, almost 20% behind bars. So what we know in this country from a historical data perspective is that this get tough on crime rhetoric, frankly, is the communities of color bear the brunt of it. And that we would be better off investing in evidence-based practices like, let me share a few, Cahoots in Eugene, putting behavioral health specialists on the streets that can help, frankly, folks that are experiencing behavioral health challenges as opposed to having a law enforcement response. That particular program saves about $8 million a year for the taxpayers of Eugene. By investing in calming initiatives, ensuring there's more green spaces, making sure that our streets are kept up, by investing in programs that put kids to work during the summer, youth employment programs. All of these programs are much more effective than putting people in jail and destroying families and destroying communities.
Governor Hutchinson, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Portland's issues in 2020 and 2021, but in 2022, Arkansas has had the 4th highest violent crime rate in the country. And in 2023, Arkansas has had the 5th highest incarceration rate in the country. So what do you see as the connection between violent crime and incarceration? Is getting tough working?
Well, let me back up. I asked that question to Governor Brown, and thank you for the answer. But let me tell you how we handled the George Floyd protest that turned violent in Arkansas. And so we have an urban area, Little Rock, and we had the very legitimate protest after the murder of George Floyd. But I'm watching it just like every other citizen does, just like we watched Portland, Oregon. And there was violence. There was buildings that were being burned. There was personal injuries and assaults occurring as a result of the violence connected to those protests. The Capitol was threatened, and we had a chief of police that did not take appropriate action, and it was getting worse. And so I took action, and I called out the Arkansas State Police. I put them in command of an incident command center. I brought in some National Guard to provide additional support, and we deployed those. And the first night they were deployed, we arrested, civilian arrest, 70 people for their criminal acts. And guess what happened? The next night, there was no violence, there was no burning, it all stopped, and the peaceful protests continued. And I think that is simply what we need in America, which is enforcing the law. Now, we also talked a little bit about the other aspects of the discrimination that has a disparate impact in some of our institutions. So let me talk about that for a second. First of all, I hope we never go to a racial quota system for our criminal justice system. That seems odd to me.
So, Asa, I'm going to stop you right there and ask the question. Are people of color in your state disproportionately impacted by your criminal justice system? Or is there equivalent numbers of people of color serving time behind bars as there is white people?
The majority on death row are Caucasian. The majority in prison are Caucasian. I could not tell you the exact breakdown. But I will tell you that I agree there's some institutional bias. For example, we had, when I was head of the DEA, a 100-to-1 ratio for penalties for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. So if someone had crack cocaine, they could be sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 10 years with 1/100th of the quantity that would take to sentence someone with powder cocaine, and there's a racial disparity there. So I worked and supported a collapsing of that disparity because it did have an adverse racial impact, and we were successful down to 20-to-1. I support the Equal Act, which would bring it to a 1-to-1 ratio. And so there's always things that we need to look at to improve the system to make sure it works well. But you don't use that as a means to stop enforcing the law or to decriminalize. And you raise the issue of decriminalization, and I really do believe that we can adjust. We don't have to incarcerate. If somebody is guilty of simple possession or they have an addiction problem, we should look at alternative sentencing, absolutely. And that's why I've been a proponent of drug treatment courts. They're a great success story. But I also don't believe we ought to decriminalize, because if you decriminalize and somebody has cocaine and you give them a traffic ticket and say, please appear in court, that minimizes it. Or if it's marijuana in the same way, or opioids, these are serious consequences to our youth and to our communities. And just the fact that their criminal conduct makes a difference in acceptance or non-acceptance. And so we have a difference of opinion on that.
Well, just to clarify, so first of all, I'm a lawyer as well. Please don't hold that against me. And I have acted within the law in using my powers as governor. The clemency powers of the governor in the state of Oregon in Article 5, Section 14 are very broad and frankly unfettered, with the exception of treason crimes. So whether it regards to the death penalty or other commutations, remitting fines so people can get their driver's license, I have that authority. The governor of Oregon has that authority. That might not be the case. Secondly, certainly in the city of Portland, Portland police enforced the law, and the prosecutor followed suit in terms of enforcing person-to-person crimes during the violence. And I will tell you, they had assistance from the Oregon State Police, which clearly are under my authority. So I believe very strongly that we need to enforce the law.
Did not some of the other law enforcement...
But the law to decriminalize was actually a ballot measure that voters passed. And because they have the ability to make law in Oregon as well through the initiative and referendum process. I don't know if you have that ability in your state. We do. Our voters have used it on both progressive and conservative measures, including our Get Tough on Crime measures. So we obviously, and the legislature agreed, that the laws the voters passed need to be enforced. My understanding is the Oregon legislature made some recent changes to that law, which I think is a good thing. So sometimes we don't always control the laws that get passed by our voters. And that was a particular case where the voters supported it.
I want to get back to my question, which for Governor Hutchinson, which was, Arkansas has an incredibly high violent crime rate. Arkansas also has an incredibly high incarceration rate. Are those two connected? What's going on?
Well, first of all, let's look at the crime rate. And yes, I think we're probably in the top 10 in terms of violent crime rates in Arkansas. And if you look at the other states that are high, there's Tennessee, there's Mississippi, there's New Orleans, there's traditional poverty areas, there's traditional Delta areas, low employment. So there is an economic connection there, and Arkansas has an adverse impact there as a result of that. In terms of the incarceration rate,
it's one of only 4 states to increase its incarceration rate from 2010 to 2020. There are a lot of people incarcerated in the state of Arkansas.
I really wonder about that statistic, because our prison population did not increase dramatically during that time. So I don't see how we increased that much. Our population did grow. And so, it was during that time that we actually made adjustments. Of course, we expanded our drug courts and the alternative sentencing measures. But we have had an increase in crime. And so my successor in office, Governor Sanders, is building a 3,000-bed new prison. Because the legislature does not want to have a catch and release program in the local jails. They don't have to go to no bond requirements, and they have a problem with violence in the city. So they're, with the support of law enforcement, is increasing the bed capacity.
You and I worked on human service issues, and I think I'm curious. If I had the resources, would be putting the money from the new prison into early childhood education and making sure that kids from cradle to kindergarten had access to the supports and services that they needed, and that we would work to close the opportunity gap that takes root, frankly, in families with low incomes, in communities of color, and also in our rural communities. And the studies are very clear, the data is very clear, and from the pandemic, many states started using data to make public policy decisions. Oregon's been using data for years. Talk to me about why you don't think it's more important to be putting money into early childhood education, making sure that parents that are struggling have access to drug and alcohol treatment, why that isn't a better use of money and saves taxpayer dollars in the long run, and also, frankly, makes our communities safer.
Well, I think you can do both. I mean, we've increased our investment in pre-K, kindergarten, childhood education. We rank actually very high in terms of access to K4, K3 kindergartens. And so we stack up very well in that investment. And so, yes, I think you can do that. And certainly we've increased with the drug treatment, the counseling, the addiction counseling. We've invested in that. We've used federal dollars that have come in as a result of the pandemic for that purpose. But to me, none of that is a substitute for also making sure that we have adequate facilities for those that might be violent in our society. So I don't think you say, well, we need to take the money that you're going to invest in the criminal justice system and we've got to put it to early childhood education. Let's do both because the children are endangered in Central Arkansas because of drive-by shootings.
Which involve guns, right?
You want to take those away too?
I think we should ban assault weapons in this country. Absolutely. Absolutely. Are you kidding me?
Well, welcome to the South. We're not. It's not going to happen. And so you want to protect the
federal government had the guts. Congress had the guts, I believe, in 1994 to pass an assault weapons ban. It expired. I would hope that Congress would find the ability to pass it again.
But Governor Brown, I wanted to ask a little bit, because I think that it's important when we're having conversations about crime that we recognize that there are lots of different types of crime. And what works to stop some forms of crime is not very effective with stopping other forms of crime. What do you see the relationship between poverty and violent crime? Because I was struck by the fact that, I heard you having a conversation about how the crime and poverty and crime and race play a massive role. But then we also see that there are, one of the people that wound up having his death sentence commuted was Christian Longo in Oregon. And Christian Longo, you may have heard the story, he murdered his wife and his 3 children. He fled to Mexico, and then he took on the identity of a former New York Times reporter, Michael Finkel. He was eventually arrested, obtained. He has basically said that he is a sociopath and he doesn't know why he does these things. And so I'm interested to hear how you think about, when I hear a story like that, I know I'm a Catholic, and I oppose the death penalty, but it's mostly because I don't think I could be responsible for the death of another person. But I also think that there's no amount of early childhood education
Absolutely.
or poverty mitigation that would make Christian Longo not a psychopathic, asshole.
Wow.
So I'm curious to see how you think about the relationship between poverty and violent crime specifically. Because I want to ask the governor about property crime and incarceration, but I want to ask about violent crime
So-
for you.
In terms of the death penalty, there is no question that these folks have committed heinous crimes, crimes that are absolutely unspeakable, that most of us can't even bear to hear about. And particularly this case was egregious. And I absolutely believe that folks like him should be spending life behind bars. Absolutely. The number one top priority in making these decisions for me is public safety. The second concern I have, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that unlike other sentences, an execution, the death penalty carried to the full extent, can't be changed. Once committed, you can't take it back. And we know in this country that there have been mistakes made. And from my perspective, that's absolutely intolerable. In terms of the connection between poverty, I will say racism, colonialism, and violent crime, I think, as I said earlier, the data is clear that by giving children and families access to early childhood education, to support and services, substantially reduces. Does it eliminate? Absolutely not. The chance that someone might grow up to be a violent offender. But I think what's most important is that we center the voices of the communities that are most impacted by these violent acts. And in a lot of these cases, the gun violence is occurring in communities of color.
Right.
And in my conversations with both former offenders, adults in custody, and community activists, programs like CRED that Secretary Duncan started here in Chicago, or worked with others to start here in Chicago, have been incredibly effective. That programs that enable folks like that I have commuted, a young man by the name of Mulu, who had a particular specialty around providing drug and alcohol treatment to young people, that peer-to-peer mentoring and service and support providing is incredibly effective. So is early childhood education the answer? No, but it is not a path that we have actually tried in this country to require universal early childhood education for every young child in this country. We could try it and see what happens, because we know that putting more people behind bars is not the answer.
What I have, in the work that I've done, and I've done a lot of work on criminal justice reform, it's something of a passion of mine. What I've heard from people I talk to who are largely in working class neighborhoods of color is that they experience simultaneous over-policing and under-policing. The cops are always there until you really need them to be there. Now, what we've seen in some cities, like Portland, for example, is large numbers of police deciding to retire for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. That means there are fewer police, and that also means that the police who are there might not be the highest quality of police. You, as governor of a blue state dealing with the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, you had to walk an incredibly difficult line. Mm-hmm. You were attempting to work with communities that were responding to violence from police that they had seen, whether personally or just experienced in life. But they also want people to get policed. They want to know that if someone breaks into their car or steals their car or runs their car into their front porch, as I had a friend to have that happen to them, that someone will come and deal with it. How did you try to ride that line?
So it was challenging, there's no question about it. I worked really hard to center the voices of folks from our Black and Brown communities. I created a racial justice council that literally helped me craft my budget for 21-23, and then the new governor, 23-25, and help me set my agenda, particularly around criminal justice reform. At the same time, I continued to fight for more funding, and I think if you look at the numbers, the funding for the Oregon State Police went up while I was governor. We had more resources thanks to our federal partners that were quite helpful during the pandemic, at least when Biden came in office. Though, of course, Trump actually sent us a lot of money too, as I recall. I could be wrong about that. But I think the work we really have to look up at how we change our policing model. And for example, the agency that oversees our law enforcement training really has to do a better job to be both trauma-informed and culturally responsive. And that is work that I tried to embed in the agency before I left. We also work to, I'll say, coordinate where possible when the city of Portland needed assistance to assist by adding Oregon State Police and frankly, on rare occasions, the National Guard at the ready if we were concerned about a particular incident. So we were playing a supportive role. And for me, the reason why I felt comfortable with the Oregon State Police is they had both the crowd control training and, from my perspective, the trauma-informed and culturally responsive training that was needed. I think we need new models for policing in this country. And I think this is the type of institution where those conversations need to occur. What does policing look like so that people feel safe and feel comfortable, so that communities know that when they pick up the phone, law enforcement is going to arrive, right? What does that look like? And I think it involves training. I think it involves more community voices at the table in terms of what that training looks like. And I think there has to be more research done. I don't think defunding the police is the answer. Long answer, sorry.
No, that was great. Governor Hutchinson, I wanted to ask you, one of your points of emphasis through your criminal justice reform package was not just expanding the number of prisons, but also working with folks who are on parole and being able to keep a close monitor on folks on parole to avoid recidivism, and also working to expand funding for public defenders. But in 2022, public defenders in the state of Arkansas could expect to handle as many as 400 cases, which is about 4 times the high pre-COVID. How do you think Arkansas should respond to those challenges over the coming years?
Well, first of all, we answered that challenge of the public defenders and the prosecutors by putting additional resources in both. And this is post-COVID. We didn't try cases during the period of COVID, and so all the criminal cases got backed up, and so they needed more resources to catch up. It was a tragic situation when the cases aren't being processed. And so I pushed the judges and we put resources there. We hired more prosecutors, but we hired an equivalent number of public defenders to assist as well. So that's an important part of it in terms of balancing that. And we've got our cases moving again. Kate, you mentioned about support for law enforcement. One of the things that we did, and we shared many of the same challenges, but we took our state money and part federal resources, but we gave every certified law enforcement officer in the state of Arkansas a $5,000 stipend bonus. And that was a one-time, but it covered all of our city, county certified officers. And then we significantly raised the salaries of our state police as well. That was our way of saying, let's support the police. When it comes to I mentioned one side of the George Floyd protest and the action I took to enforce the law. Simultaneously, I brought the protest leaders into my office and asked, what are you after? What do you want? What's the game plan here? And they had genuine reform that they wanted to accomplish. And I asked, would you be willing to serve on a task force to accomplish that or to look at this? And they said yes. And so I put the protest leaders on the task force, and I put law enforcement on the same task force. They worked for about 4 months and came back with some extraordinary recommendations. They were adopted into legislative change. Part of it was community policing. Part of it was actually increasing the pay and recommendations on that. Part of it was more racial sensitivity training and also making sure that officers who have engaged in inappropriate aggressive conduct, excessive use of force, that they can't go from one department to another department and get hired. But we have a state database now that's shared with all of our law enforcement so that we make sure somebody that has that kind of track record is not rehired. So those are a couple of good things that came out of a tragic circumstance.
Governor Brown, I want to ask you, something that I found interesting is that according to the Oregon Justice Resource Center, Oregon's crime rate decreased from 2019 to 2021. Be sure and let everyone who reads National Review know. But Oregon's homicide rate jumped from 2019 to 2021. It's 4.2 homicides per 100,000 people, which is still, on a national basis, very low, but that is a 50% increase. Why do you think that happened?
I think it is a reflection of the trauma our communities are feeling, and I don't know the time frame in terms of that jump, but our country is struggling. Is that a fair statement? We are dealing with underlying challenges about what our fundamental rights are. I think we are struggling to answer the question, how do we eradicate racism from our systems, not just our criminal justice system, but our education system, our human service system, et cetera. And I think in part, Oregon's laws around firearm safety have improved over my time in the governor's office, but it has been methodical and incremental. And Oregonians just passed a very tough ballot measure in terms of access to guns, but the courts have put it on hold right now. So I do think an assault weapons ban would make a difference. On October 1st, 2015, I got a call from our law enforcement because we had a mass shooting at one of our local community colleges. I will never, ever forget that day. I will never forget the impact on families. And my heart goes out to all the families that have been impacted by gun violence since 2015, since time immemorial. And I don't think they're easy answers. This is incredibly challenging work. But I do know, unless we plan on keeping people in prison behind bars forever, incarceration is not the answer. It simply is not.
In about 20 seconds, we're going to move to Q&A. So especially if you're a student, think about your questions. Get ready. It's very exciting. I wanted to ask Governor Hutchinson one question, which is about a specific case of one of the people who was executed in 2017, the case of Liddell Lee. And he was executed on April 20th, 2017. In 2021, DNA testing found unknown male DNA that was not his on the murder weapon. He had court-appointed attorneys. One attorney was dealing with an addiction issue. Another attorney was living with mental illness that at that point had not been diagnosed. His other attorneys were dealing with conflicts of interest. You have said before that the DNA evidence, so in this case, did not present any conclusive evidence that changed your opinion of this case. Is that still true?
Yes. First of all, the ineffective assistance of counsel, if that was the allegation, has been reviewed by the courts and all the way up through the state court system, all the way through the federal court system. and they all concluded that the jury verdict of guilt was justified. And so, with those findings, I felt comfortable with the actual guilt of it. Later on, after the execution, they did additional DNA that did not change the circumstances of the original conviction. So it didn't change my view on that.
Okay, I think we are ready for questions. I think the microphone is right here. The first 4 questions go to students. So if you're a University of Chicago student, please ask a question. If you're not a University of Chicago student, hold on. Be cool. If you could state your name, your year, and please make sure that it is a question, not a long, rambling comment on your views on the nature of time and space.
Got it. Hi, my name is Shannon. I'm a second year in the college, and my question is for Governor Hutchinson. You mentioned and acknowledged the correlation between poverty and increasing crime, especially in your state. And as a Republican, I'm assuming you're less supportive of government intervention and increasing the welfare state. So what would you say is like the Republican solution to decreasing poverty so you have less crime?
Thank you, and a great appropriate question. The answer is you want to increase health care services, which we've done through the expanded Medicaid. We also want to create jobs, and so in one of our most poverty-stricken area, the Delta, Mississippi County, we recruited United States Steel that came in, created 900 jobs, paying $100,000 apiece. And so, creation of jobs and that opportunity makes a difference in eliminating the poverty and giving people a chance to come up. And then it's also about equal opportunities in education. I came from a rural area of Arkansas, and I made sure that when we enhanced computer science education, we required it to be taught in every high school, regardless, not urbans, but the rural areas, to give them a chance at a good education. And so we tried to make sure they were on target for that. So healthcare, job creation, education.
Let me just push back on it a little bit, but I am going to give you kudos on the computer science because I think that was your initiative as chair of the National Governors Association. So let's give them applause on that one. I absolutely agree that having a healthcare access is incredibly important. 95% of Oregonians have access to coverage because we expanded Medicaid access years ago, including to our immigrant children and now their families. But I have to say, if that's the answer in conservative Republican states, most states have not actually taken full advantage of expanded federal access to health care, and in fact have specifically denied access. In terms of job training, really proud of the work we're doing around Future Ready Oregon to provide specific funding in specific communities for both career and technical education. It was a $200 million initiative, career and technical education, as well as community college access for free for students. So we're doing some really great work. I think that is something that governors across the entire country absolutely agree on. So, thanks.
Hi, I'm Sean. I'm a second year at the college. I have a question for Governor Brown. You mentioned trying to take a data-based approach when dealing with policy, but specifically in regards to your idea of an assault weapons ban. Assault weapons only account for 3% of all homicides in the U.S. So I'm wondering how you reckon this with your data-based approach and how it is a data-based approach. Thank you.
I think it's pretty simple. It's more common sense than anything, and that is these guns don't really have a purpose other than being able to shoot a lot of people at one time. And I think our society would be a lot safer if we didn't have them easily accessible. I think if you look at countries around the world, and their work to substantially limit access to weapons, particularly like assault weapons, you will see that they have substantially fewer shootings and obviously fewer mass shootings than we do in this country. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, a couple of very good examples.
But sorry to jump in here, but I am curious as to, is this an aiming to limit the number of mass incidents, which I think we've seen repeatedly the use of assault-style weapons being used. And just because gun Twitter will get after me, it's important to be specific of the types of weapons that we're talking about. So when we're talking about assault-style weapons, those are kind of our larger, higher capacity guns. So, but I'm just curious if that's just 3% of those being available. When we're talking about the most common forms of gun violence, which are not mass incidents are actually, are still mercifully quite rare. What impact do you think that would? Do you think that still matters? That still has a big impact?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, let me come in there. I think the point is well taken that we ought to do things that make a difference. And I think everyone knows if someone is homicidal, if they're suicidal, if they're intent on committing a violent act, they're going to have access to some weapon, particularly if they have criminal intent. Criminals have access to it. And so if you don't get a semi-automatic that's dressed up like an assault weapon, they're going to have another weapon. I think there is an argument that in the mass shootings that other types of weapons are easier to respond to, and you have breaks in the fire. That's a legitimate point of conversation. But an assault AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon, just like my Springfield semi-automatic handgun. And so the challenge is distinguishing those and doing something that makes a difference. And that's why we do have a consensus on school safety, investing in that, which we've all done. But I would raise the question that that's going to disappoint a lot of people. You ban one particular type of weapons, you're still going to have the shootings that occur, unless you address the hard issue.
I would just say 3%, how many deaths? Not acceptable to me when it could be preventable. And the second piece is that's why a number of states have moved forward on red flag laws to be able to take guns out of the hands of those who might be dangerous. And I think it is primarily blue states that have moved forward on red flag laws because they are evidence-based.
Governor Hutchinson, does Arkansas have a red flag law?
We do not.
Why is that?
Well, because it wouldn't get through the legislature for one reason, but also we're still looking at Florida, a red state that has a red flag law, and so we're studying the impacts of that and whether it works. I would go back though, since time immemorial, but certainly since the 70s, we had a different approach, and the law already is that if someone is a danger to themselves, suicidal, or a danger to others, homicidal, then you can go to the court and get them committed. You can have medical evaluations. There's a process to do that. The civil libertarians took us away from that through the 70s, 80s, and we never have gone back. And so there's still a means, even without a red flag law, in order to adjudicate someone that might pose a risk.
The libertarians did it.
Yeah.
I know. I'm so sorry.
Here's the deal, though. None of these is this, I don't want to use this metaphor, will solve the issues, right? Not one of them. But multiple layers will certainly make a difference. We learned that during the pandemic. One thing didn't prevent the spread. It was multiple things and multiple people participating. And the same is true with gun violence prevention and, frankly, public safety.
Thank you so much for a great question that apparently inspired us all to just have this giant conversation. Please.
Hi, my name's Luke. I'm a fourth year in the college, and this question is for Governor Hutchinson. So in Texas, Greg Abbott recently promised to pardon a man convicted of shooting a protester before the sentence was even handed down, and his self-defense was that the man had a gun, an AK-47 in his hands. And I was wondering, as governor, would you have done the same thing?
I'm doubtful that I would. I would have to, I did read something about it, and, but I don't know enough about the facts to know precisely. So I can't judge that. Governors use their commutation, their pardon powers uniquely, and as long as it's specifically reviewed, he has the discretion to do it. But I would be doubtful that I would do that, but I'd have to look at that.
I'm assuming you wouldn't have?
I would, it's incredibly difficult for us to comment on specific cases. Obviously, I would consider the entire circumstance of the situation.
But that actually brings up very quickly, no, you're good, you can go.
Yeah.
It's cool. It actually brings up an interesting question that I have for me, which is that you're governors of very different states, you were governors of very different states, but you're still operating in our national media milieu, in which Fox News host Tucker Carlson can make a news story and can force Texas's governor to respond. Or there can be pressure put on a blue state governor of one state that a blue state governor of another state responds. What is it like trying to respond? You're working on behalf of folks in Arkansas and folks in Oregon, but you're part of the national political milieu. You talk to one another, you meet one another, you get screamed at by the same national pundits. What is that like, and how do you deal with it?
So one of the joys of being a governor, other than it's a fairly unique position in the country, is that we very often work across party lines, across the country, around the region. For the most part, governors tend to be pragmatists. I like to say we have to GSD, get stuff done. And it's really great to work with my colleagues. And Asa and I aren't always going to agree, as you can hear from today's discussion, but we worked very closely together on health and human services issues. Actually, I really am supportive of his initiative around computer science education, making sure every student has access. So we work together, and sort of the social media interactions aside, the poking at the city of Portland. Notice he did not poke at the city of Chicago because he didn't want to, make anybody here grumpy. It's really fabulous, honestly, to be able to share experiences, replicate best practices, and learn from one another. And we don't see enough of that happening at the federal level in Congress today, and that's incredibly unfortunate.
I hope we can get to these questions.
Yes, absolutely.
But let me just add, the media does play a role. I mean, if somebody came to me on a controversial case and they needed a pardon or a commutation, it's actually helpful if they go to the media and build public support for it. That is, governors pay attention to that, and it influences public opinion. So we do respond and take into consideration some of the public thought through the media.
Especially governors who have aspirations for other offices.
Who would that be?
Please.
Hello, my name is Sintra. I'm a second-year student at the college, and my question is very similar to the first question that was asked. Governor Hutchinson, most of your policy is oriented towards crimes that have already been committed or punitive measures, while Governor Brown, yours is more preventative measures. Would you guys say that punitive or preventative measures are more important, and what preventative measures would you like to see put in place?
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and both are very important. Like, as head of the DEA, we worked on drug education, we worked on prevention. It's critically important on fentanyl. But yes, if somebody is dispensing fentanyl and selling it, let's put them in jail because it kills people. And so that's, we can concentrate on both, and they're both a very important part of our criminal justice system.
I don't disagree with that. I think we absolutely need to do both. In terms of prevention, obviously making sure people have access to substance abuse, alcohol, and drug treatment. At least in my state, unfortunately, the jails are the place where people with behavioral health issues sometimes get treatment. We don't have enough behavioral health treatment. We need to make sure that the pipeline for behavioral health, substance abuse treatment is diverse and reflects the communities we're serving, and we're certainly investing and working on that. I mentioned earlier investing in early childhood education. Anything we can do to eradicate poverty, making sure students, youth have access to summer employment, investing in career and technical education. We know the data is clear in Oregon. When students have access to 2 or more CTE classes in high school, their graduation rates go up to 98%. So it's pretty extraordinary. I mentioned sort of greening of cities so that community can feel proud. That is also evidence-based. And then really importantly, the work that organizations like Cahoots are doing, professional behavioral health trained, responding to crises on the streets. In Eugene, 20% of the calls, 911 calls, are Cahoots response. Thanks to Senator Wyden, this program is going national. So I think that's a fabulous model. CRED here in Chicago, I know there's other models, so definitely.
Please feel free to line up if you have more questions. Really interested to hear what everyone has to say. And just, this is very exciting for me, so please.
It's often been said that states are
what's your name and year?
So I'm not a student. I think we finished the floor, right? We did,
okay, great.
I hope. My name is Chalav Gidwani. My question is, it's been said that states are the laboratories of democracy, and I'm just curious, when you two were looking to implement policies within your states, can you point to any specific examples of other states that you looked at and said, this policy has worked in that state in the past, so I think it should be implemented here?
Are you talking only criminal justice or other issues as well?
I would say specifically criminal justice, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I started to say we do that frequently. The work requirement, for example, and some of the waivers on Medicaid and how that's implemented, we look at other states all the time. In terms of criminal justice, I think the alternative sentencing courts is really state initiatives, and the states have adopted that. We learn from each other as to what works. Veterans courts, mental health courts, drug courts, and so we learn from each other.
My department, a corrections head, or the person who was my department corrections head is now at the federal system under the Biden administration. But her model was the Norway system in terms of criminal justice and incarceration. We, as a result of her work, we no longer refer to inmates, the people behind bars, as inmates. We call them adults in custody, the goal being to humanize them. So I would just say the Norway system was something that we brought home. I mentioned earlier the Cahoots model. I know that is happening in other communities around the state, around the United States. So I can't think of anything else specific. I know eliminating solitary confinement, which should be eliminated in this country. It is absolutely cruel and unusual punishment. And so I've certainly looked to other countries and other states for best practices around that.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a second year in the college, and I would love to hear both of your thoughts on the proliferation of private prisons in the U.S. and also the practice of using the labor of incarcerated individuals to generate profit. Thank you.
You want to go first?
I'll take that one since you're named Kate. We don't use it in Oregon. I find it appalling and unjust. I mentioned at the outset of my remarks how our criminal justice system is truly built on underlying racist policy, and that it will take a long time to deconstruct that. I believe that private penal systems really take that to the nth degree, and obviously not paying people is also, frankly, a vestige of slavery as well. We in Oregon do have a ballot measure passed by the voters that requires adults in custody to work or participate in an educational program. About 2/3 of them do. My sense is that certainly they're paid. It's only minimal. I think you're going to see the Oregon legislature having that conversation.
My response to the question is that we've tried to utilize private sector for expansion of prisons, certain areas. It actually didn't work effectively simply because their cost of construction went up because of inflation, so it didn't cost out, and so we never were able to accomplish that. But we were going to build a regional jail, and now one of the disadvantages is the education services, the services that are needed in the prisons to help the inmates to go out and make a living whenever they finish their sentence, is not as effective in the private sector. They don't make the same investment, and they're usually more short term. And so there is a distinction, and you got to be careful about utilizing those. In terms of the labor of inmates, we utilize that in Arkansas, and it's really important for the inmates. They don't want to sit in their jail cell. They want to be able to be productive. They want to learn a trade. They want to be able to work with their hands, and it gives them the opportunity to do that. It should never be abusive, but or allowed extraordinary profits on it. But the industrial side, the production side is very important. In Arkansas, we have the farm. And so they produce their own agricultural products, they consume them in the prisons, and they get out and they work with their hands and learn skills.
I will just add, because most of the adults in custody, at least in Oregon, and I think around the country, get out at some point. The opportunity to work or go to school is incredibly important. It provides job training and hopefully provides a smoother transition when they're released from custody. These folks become our neighbors, they're our community members. It's important that they be able to succeed in their communities.
This is going to be our last question. So
well, it segues very nicely into what you were just talking. I'm not a student, I'm a very old alumni from one of the graduate programs. I really loved her question. And one of the things you talk about, the preventative measures, there's a lot of outcome metrics associated with nonprofit community work with really constrained resources. And I won't go on about that because I'm not going to do the soapbox. But so what I'm wondering is, for your prisons in your states, when you have the opportunity, you have lives 24/7, $20,000 to $70,000 per person per year. What are the outcome metrics, not macro about recidivism, but on those individual prisoners or adult people who are incarcerated? What are your outcome metrics around education, mental health, substance abuse, all the kinds of things we do in preventative work? Do you have them in your prisons? And if not, what kind of outcome metrics would you institute to know that your money was being spent widely and society was being served? Thanks.
Well, first of all, we don't do enough. We need to invest more in their preparation for coming out and being successful. In Arkansas, I had the Restore Hope initiative to expand reentry programs and help them to be successful when they come out. One of the things that we do is through our expanded Medicaid, we make sure when they leave, they have an insurance card. They got a Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance card to get health insurance, and that is incredibly important in their transition. We try to match them up. We don't do enough. We've got to do better, but we have made some progress.
Absolutely agreed. On the same page with Asa, we do not do enough in Oregon. This is so bizarre to me that we wait. A huge portion of folks coming into custody, 60% of them, 60-70% have some type of substance abuse or behavioral health problem. At least on the substance abuse side, we do not start to provide treatment until there are 6 months before their release. So one of the ways I used my clemency powers was to release folks early so they could get into a residential drug and alcohol treatment program, which is horrifying to me, and I'm hoping the legislature will rectify that. This is no different than someone having diabetes. You have to have treatment. This is a medical issue, and people need treatment, and they need it as soon as they walk in to the prison system.
And with that, Governor Brown, Governor Hutchinson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very nice
Thank
job.
you.